Calling to the floor FS20, Paul.
Paul Coates, American Wood Council. There is a uniqueness to Type 3 construction in Table 601. You have the 2-hour bearing exterior walls, and you have in 3A the 1-hour floor, 3B the unrated floor. The 2-hour coming historically from what was termed ordinary or described as ordinary construction. It's not the similar situation in Type 2. There's an equal rating, typically 1-hour exterior walls, 1-hour floor. We're getting a lot of questions. This hasn't always been a problem or a question, but we are getting quite a few questions now about the continuity of the exterior wall when the lesser rated floor meets it. This is not too much of a problem in balloon framing, where the fire resistance protection can be carried up past the floor, but it is a challenge in platform framing, which is common construction method and very strong connection for the floor and the exterior wall, and in fact provides quite a bit of inherent fire resistance that the platform construction detail does. So it's not been so much a concern in the past, it's becoming a little more of a concern. There's really no test for an intersection like this in terms of fire resistance rating. It's not a typical assembly test or an E119 test. What this proposal does is attempts to say whatever you can do that would be acceptable in terms of adding fire resistance rating at that intersection, including the contribution of the fire resistance of the floor in the case of the exterior wall. And we have details demonstrating this now posted on our website in our new Design for Code Acceptance number 6 document as far as substantiation for these kind of details. And the last thing is there is a sentence in there regarding fire retardant treated wood and where it needs to be and where it doesn't need to be. My time's up, so I'll answer questions on that if you need.
Thank you.
Question?
Oh, got some questions.
As I read this sounds like it's really geared for wood frame construction, but it could easily be done with metal as well, in which case you wouldn't be able to use solid wood blocking because that's for combustible construction. How do you see this working for metal frame?
I believe you can use blocking if it's in Type 2 construction. I believe you have an exception for using combustible blocking.
You can, but the reference to the section on blocking, I believe, is specific to combustible construction. I could be wrong on that.
I'll take a look. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions? Seeing none. Testimony and support. Larry?
Larry Wayner, SBC. I'll just follow up with me too on everything you said. The last part of that was the question about the fire retardant treated lumber question. Our members have come to us here in the last year or so, several times, multiple times actually. We've written research reports based on that, based on what the code currently says. We've come up with details very similar to what AWC also put out, so you'll see those on our website as well. Point being that there are some building officials who are maybe architects, engineers as well, who are specifying fire retardant treated lumber at the end of floor systems over the Type 3 wall where fire retardant treated lumber is permitted, and requiring that in the ends of the floor truss system. So for floor truss manufacturers, that means there's a whole other inventory item they got to carry. They typically don't carry fire retardant treated lumber, so that's got to be brought in. There's question potentially about the fire resistant rating of the assembly that you're putting in that floor. When you put fire retardant treated lumber in there, does that or does that not affect that rating from a load carrying perspective? There are ways to deal with that, but the point is that the code is very clear that the floor assemblies are of any permitted material. The wall assemblies are permitted to have fire retardant treated lumber, but that's for the wall, and the wall ends at the top layer of the wall if you look at the definitions. Thank you.
Thank you. Further support? Do we have in the crowd there, is there any further supports? Seeing none. Opposition?
And development representing of AWC as well as CPG. I have understand the intent, and Yeah, I'll be the first to agree we need clarification, absolutely. But as I read the definition, I find that with that intent, the focus is far too narrow. It assumes a particular type of construction is only going to be assumed within this entire assembly, this entire building, the entire envelope, as well as the support structure. Structures can be supported, obviously, other than just exterior walls, right? So what about frame structures and piers and pilasters and beams and columns and posts and foundation piers, et cetera, all the way down the line that gives support to the above floors, but which are not mentioned in this particular definition? It needs to be reworked. Again, I understand and applaud the intent for clarification, but as written, this is not ready. It needs to be amended, improved, whatever. What about block and plank construction, for instance, as an example, right down at the non-combustible zone at that first floor? So that's point number one. Point number two, since I don't have a bevy of time, is the definition and the guidance coming from exterior walls for section 705. The very first phrase, where floors. Well, what if it's not this assumed method of construction at the intersecting floor? Again, a block and plank construction at that intersection. The carry-through, you see the flow-through. We were guided to go to Design for Code Acceptance, DCA number 3, in the reasoning statement. I see that number 4 is in Chapter 35. I don't see DCA number 3. I'm sure that it could be assumed to be embodied in another reference, but it's not mentioned. It seems to be discontinuity. I suggest we ask for some clarification when it's ready for prime time. Please disallow. Thank you.
Question?
Yes.
Yes. You mentioned on the definition there concern because it says that it's supported by the bearing exterior wall. I worked on a committee that wrote the definition for light frame, and they used the word primarily in there. Would it improve or address your concern if it said where the floor structure is primarily supported by the bearing exterior and interior walls below?
My good member of the committee here, you have the wherewithal to include, let's say, a more generic definition if you feel that would be it. But I've got to warn you, the focus, the way that this was written, was as if there was only one type of construction from beginning to end. And I would ask you to step back and say, well, what if it's an entirely different type of construction? Is it just going to be bearing from the exterior walls, but what about the other types of wall systems? And from then, I think you can generate a far more generic term.
Repeating your testimony to try and answer the question. Did you get your answer, Dennis?
Well, your answer raises another question. When you said primarily one type of construction, primarily what type of construction? Because there's platform framing and multiple types of construction, so I'm not understanding what you're saying.
For instance, what if the structural support system below, carrying the load resistance path, now included a column? That simple concept is missing. A pier, a pilaster. You see what I'm saying? You could have a simple generic phrase that encompasses all structural members giving support above.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Further opposition? Jay?
Jay Hall, representing the Portland Cement Association. What I believe the previous speaker was trying to say is there's many types of platform construction. Block and plank is one of them. This muddies the water. Obviously, they're talking about type 3, which is going to be your typical wood studs and stuff. But there are other types of platform, as one of the other gentlemen mentioned. So we've gone from ordinary construction to now we allow fire retardant wood within the wall of the 2-hour assembly. Now we want to let nominal wood, unprotected wood go in there. There's no rating for this. This is somebody's idea that this might work. Keep in mind, there's no guarantee this is going to be sprinkled. Okay, so you could have something very, very minimal protecting the intersection to where this joist goes into the fire retardant treated wood. Keep in mind, fire retardant treated wood is not non-combustible. It's got a 20-minute ignition delay, and then it's going to burn fine. This is an attempt to water down the code because, yes, it's tough to do the balloon framing, but you need to keep the continuity of the fire rating all the way up the wall. Again, what if, we talk about the wall stops at the at the top of the platform. Well, it really doesn't if you're looking at what if you have to rate from the exterior. I mean, when you're looking at it from the exterior, there's no break that you can see. It's all exterior wall. The wood document, the document they're describing, it's not part of a reference. It's not referenced in the code. That's a problem. I'm going to have to go by that. I'm going to look for it every time. Contractors have to look for it. I think that's all I have. Any questions?
Thank you. Further opposition?
Steve Thomas, representing myself. Obviously, I want to solve a problem, but I don't think this is it. I think there's a lot of confusion in this language. First of all, they've addressed platform construction, not balloon framing. As been stated, those kind of things. Seems to address wood. What about steel? When we actually look at the language, it says the exterior wall has to be protected at the intersection, maintain the continuity of the fire resistance rating as required by 704.1. Well, okay, so I read that and it tells me I have to maintain that exterior wall rating. So does that mean that the perimeter framing of the building has to be fire resistance rating? That's what we're trying to fix here. How do I do that at the rim joist? How do I do that at the rim board? And then it says, the fire resistance rating shall be maintained through the use of materials permitted by the type of construction but not limited to. Well, wait a minute. Are we talking about a fire resistance rating or not? I got an inspector that's going to look at that and say, well, you got to give me a tested assembly. It says fire resistance rating. Where's the tested assembly for this rim board? And then they're going to say, well, but none of those things give me any tested assemblies there. So I think the language is confusing. It's not complete. Although I'd love to find a solution to our problem, I don't think this is it.
Thank you. Further opposition? Steve?
Yes, Steve Scalco for the Masonry Alliance for Codes and Standards, and I want to make sure I emphasize a point that has been made here, and that is Type 3 construction, which is started out way back under ordinary, but even under the more modern codes, is exterior walls with non-combustible construction. And then there is a provision there that does say, however, it does allow the use of fire retardant treated wood within the wall assembly, provided it meets the requirements in Chapter 23. So we're talking about a wall that, for all practical purposes, is either non-combustible or fire retardant treated wood, which is not non-combustible, but at least the code accepts it right now. And now you introduce this floor ceiling system in there that actually can contain normal wood frame construction. And so, in my opinion, you've totally destroyed the integrity of the wall system and no longer is serving the purpose that it was intended. On top of that, the way both these provisions read, whether it's one extending into an exterior wall or going through or into an interior wall, if the interior wall is required to have a high fire rating, it's going to allow the floor ceiling system to be something less than what the wall is. And so that we do, in fact, have a weakness. Now, I have looked at their DCA 3. It has some interesting details in there. It is with regard to, let's say, the American Wood Council's idea of what may be acceptable. But from the standpoint of having anything that has been documented or referenced in the code or shown that it, in fact, will work other than through some evaluation, we don't have anything else to go by. So in my opinion, this thing is just creating a weakness. I also want to make one last comment. I think some of the proponents said, well, you know, this is costly what they're having to try to do right now. Well, that just becomes part of what happens when you choose certain design features and how you approach them. There are ways it can be done without having to utilize this kind of a method. Thank you.
Thank you. Further opposition? Rebuttal and support? Paul?
Paul Coates, American Wood Council. I think platform framing, at least in regard to wood frame construction, is a common term. If we want to get rid of the definition, get rid of the definition. It would apply to other construction types as well. Actually, this is what's currently being done sometimes is using, because there's an assumed continuity provision about exterior walls, there are lots of interesting products, cantilever joist hangers and so forth, for those code officials in those jurisdictions that are concerned about this intersection, which is actually weakening the floor greatly in terms of fire resistance, where the platform framing is a much stronger connection. The rating is the important thing. not the presence of the fire retardant treated wood in the floor assembly itself. We're strengthening the code by requiring the rating to be demonstrated to be maintained for the wall.
Thank you.
So here's your support.
Thank you. Further rebuttal and support.
Larry Wayne at SBC. I'll just rebut one point, and that is that if it says fire resistance rating, that is somehow required to be a tested assembly. That's not true. If you go to Chapter 7 of the Building Code, you'll find that there are actually 5 options for determining fire resistance of an assembly. One of those being tested assemblies. There are 4 other ones that are allowed. Thank you.
Thank you. Further rebuttal and support. Rebuttal and opposition. Let's keep it to the points that they brought up.
Well, Steve Scalco, Masonry Alliance for Codes and Standards, and one of the points that in the rebuttal was made is to make sure that to the committee, you introduce non-fire retardant treated wood into the assembly. Well, haven't we changed the type of construction? Because at that point, we've introduced a combustible material into the exterior wall. And if I go to Chapter 6 and look at the definitions of types of construction, I will find that, lo and behold, that sends me to Type 5 construction. So that raises the question for the code official, well, is it Type 5 or is it Type 3? And the fact is Type 3 says non-combustible walls. It has the one exception that has an allowance to use fire retardant treated wood within the wall. Once you get beyond that, if you introduce any other combustible framing, you've changed the type of construction. And that's another reason why this code change ought to be disapproved.
Steve, question. I'm confused by your statement there that you're saying that when the wood from the platform frame floor enters into the plane of the wall, you've changed the type of construction. I've seen letters from ICC staff in Whittier office and the Chicago office that would say otherwise. They call those interior building elements, and they can be of any material allowed for an interior building element. And the code and commentary says that the structure elements, through that system that support the wall have to be rated. So I'm confused where you're coming from on that. Can you clarify where you're coming from?
Be glad to. If you take an exterior wall, let's just start with it. In fact, it's primarily an issue with the exterior wall. If you take an exterior wall that is load-bearing, and with platform construction that's being described here, the floor system becomes part of the load-bearing element of the wall because it carries loads in the vertical direction. If you look at Type 3 construction, it says the exterior wall shall be non-combustible construction. It does permit fire-retardant treated wood within the wall assembly. So now when we introduce this floor system in there, because it now becomes part of the load-bearing system, and it is combustible material and not fire retardant treated, then in my opinion, we've changed the type of construction of the building.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further rebuttal and opposition. Jay?
Jay Hall with Portland Cement Association, with the rim board, that, you cannot justify that the rim board somehow meets the intent of 602. The construction has been mixed at that time. Again, there is no listing at all. This is just a judgment in a structure that very well may not be sprinklered. So you don't have that extra protection. Urge disapproval. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no one else queued up, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, is there a motion for FS20-18?
Motion disapproval.
Second. Moved and second for disapproval. Comments, Mr. Morgan?
So I'll say all the reasons stated by the opponents, but mainly because it's so specific to wood construction, I think there's many unintended consequences if it was to be approved. I find the language to be very confusing. I do think there are some contradictions with Section 704 and specifically 704.10. I think that was somewhat discussed previously by the opponents.
Thank you. Mr. Richardson.
Yeah, I'm going to vote against the standing motion, and if that fails, I'm going to make a motion for approval. And the reason for that is that there is clear feedback from staff at 2 ICC offices that the floor system where it intersects in the plane of the wall is not an element of the wall assembly subject to the FRT requirements, and in fact they've said that it's an interior building element and it can be made of any material acceptable for that in the code, and this clarifies that. This does not change the requirement for the continuity of the fire resistance rating, and it actually makes something clear that often doesn't get enforced in 704.1, that the elements in that floor assembly that support the 2R wall, and this is in the code and commentary, have to provide the structural support of the 2R walls. So I'm going to vote against this. I also want to disclose, since it's being proposed by my employer, that I did provide input into this, but it's not my proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Heiss.
Yeah, I do find, based on the testimony for people that were against this, that introducing wood into a non-combustible wall poses a problem for rating. Whether or not ICC's people have talked about it or not, the issue is, as an inspector and as a common sense, it would tell me that if something non-combustible is supposed to be there and you introduce something combustible, you've changed the style and type of construction.
Thank you. Further comments, Mr. Megadote?
Yeah, I think this would work pretty well if it was just for Type 5A construction, wood frame construction. Type 3 gets to be a problem. Type 2 gets to be a problem. I support the idea because there's a lot of misinterpretation or a lot of challenges interpreting how this should be done in the field. So I think it's a good idea that should be pursued further, but this is not fully there yet.
Thank you. Further comments? Seeing none, the motion on the floor for FS20-18 is for disapproval. Those in favor of the motion, please signify by raising your hand. Thank you. Those opposed? Thank you. That motion carries by a vote of 13-1. Mr. Moderator, FS20-18 has been disapproved.
FS20 is recommended for disapproval, 13-1. Is there an assembly action? Seeing none.